I'm sure a lot of you have come along as long-time fans of Steve's work, whether with Shellac or Big Black, as he's most noted for as a musician, or his recording work, which spans PJ Harvey, the Pixies, Jesus Lizard, My Disco, Dirty Three, and Joanna Newsom, to name 5 of 2,500 artists you've probably recorded, Steve. But this is your 5th trip to Melbourne now?
I do not know. I believe you. If you've done any research that indicates this is 5, then I'll believe you.
I'm not so sure, but I do know that on your first trip, you described Australia as a bunch of inbred, ex-Brit psychos and prisoners back on that first Big Black tour, and I was wondering if you have a different opinion of us now.
Did I really say inbred?
Yes.
Well, I apologize. Yeah. I don't know why I would have gotten that impression. You're a nation much like the United States, primarily composed of immigrants. But I like to think of myself as open-minded, and now I'm embarrassed. But then I said that.
I didn't mean to embarrass you. It's a very highly entertaining Big Black tour diary.
We had a good time. We had good hosts. Bruce and Greta from A Go-Go showed us around, and we had a terrific time. I learned what a disposal store was, and to this day I am charmed by my initial reaction to seeing people filing into a door marked disposal, as though that was how we were going to solve society's problems. Just send them to the disposal, no problem.
That Big Black show you did, the Prince of Wales, gone way back to '87, the first trip you ever made, was one of the last Big Black shows, right?
Yeah, that was on our final tour. We went from there to California, and we played a couple of shows in California, one show in Seattle, and then that was it.
Mm.
Yeah.
And when you first came to Melbourne, did Australian music mean much to you guys as a band in Big Black?
Certain bands had made it across. The Saints were, a pivotal, sort of epic-making band. The Birthday Party, the same way. The underground, like the less well-known underground bands like Grong Grong and X and Fungus Brains or whoever. There were a lot of other smaller, less well-known Australian bands that I was not that familiar with, and we got a little sprinkling of that when we were over here in the '80s.
Mm. Music for you started with a band we were talking a bit about back there. It was Ramones, right? You weren't really interested in music till you heard those guys. Yeah,
the Ramones awakened something in me, which was not just an interest in music, but an interest in broadening my worldview generally. And I have said this before, but I owe literally my entire life to the Ramones. Like the way I've conducted my life, I owe that to sort of having my mind opened by hearing the Ramones and then thinking about the Ramones and what it meant to be a creative person, regardless of what your interests were, but to find a way of expressing those interests in an honest and a legitimate fashion. So the Ramones really did. I mean, I may have attached more significance to them than they would have been comfortable with had we had a conversation about it at the time. But they really did open my mind, and I can't not acknowledge that. So.
It's a kind of common story with a lot of punks, like Greg Ginn from Black Flag. I know he was completely disinterested in music, and he was probably a little older than your average kind of hardcore band member until he heard punk. I'm assuming you might have had a similar perception of as he did of music before that point, but how did you see sort of the rock industry and music before you heard punk?
I didn't honestly consider it seriously. Like my brother had some hard rock records of the era, Alice Cooper, The Who, things like that, and I was aware of rock music. I was aware of music. My folks were into hillbilly music and folk music, and so I was aware of music, but it didn't have any special significance to me. I didn't picture myself as being part of the continuum of music until I heard the Ramones, and then I sort of identified with these goofballs that were singing about all the things that me and my friends were talking about, And then I started to think that there was room in music for not just people wearing sequins and capes or cowboy hats or whatever, but people wearing sneakers and Levi's, and that maybe I had some kind of some sort of place in the culture, that rather than just being a consumer, I felt like maybe I could participate, you know.
And then you became, I guess, a well-known figure as part of this incredible 80s underground that, you know, is probably more disparate than we've been told, but it feels like a pretty unique moment in time, all these independent labels, independent musicians. When did you become aware that that was a thing, you know? Because I imagine there was some distance between the Ramones and what you ended up doing, your early work.
Well, not much. Like, I discovered the Ramones sometime in the late 70s, let's say 78, somewhere in there. I almost immediately formed a band with my friends in Montana. And then Montana is a rural part of the United States in the high desert in the Northwest. And then I left there to go to college in Chicago. And on the way to Chicago, I did a road trip where I hit a lot of the major cities on the West Coast and then through the Midwest, and stopped at record stores everywhere, at every juncture of the road trip, and, you know, asked about records, asked about bands, and sort of started to build a base of knowledge from that sort of thing. And then when I got to Chicago, I almost immediately got ingrained in the underground music scene there, started going to shows almost immediately, tried to form a band, failed.
That's why you chose Chicago as a spot to go to college, right? On the expectation there'd be more punks there than anywhere else.
Yeah. I chose a college because I intended to study journalism, and there were several schools that had good reputations as journalism schools. One of them was in Columbia, Missouri, and one of them was in Chicago. And so between the two, I presumed that Chicago would have more interesting music, and so that was my first choice. And so I went there, and I went through college. I can't say that I was taught a lot in college. I learned a lot, but not very much of it was academic, and not much of it was in the classroom. And I consider that one of the formative experiences of my life was moving away from home, living on my own in a big city, like finding my way through a new social network that included people of a type that I'd never met before. I grew up in essentially a monoculture in Montana, which was like, in my circles, it was all, you know, white people of approximately the same heritage and very conservative social values, very conservative values. Like, there was a hint of lefty subculture in Missoula because it was a college town, and so there was a little bit more variety and breadth of experience there than in like some of the real cow towns, but not a lot. And so when I moved to Chicago and I started meeting, you know, like gay people and people who lived, you know, outsider lifestyles, and people who were sort of functioning with addiction or functioning with mental health issues, or people who had chosen rather eccentric personal lifestyles, it was mind-blowing to be in the company of all these different kinds of people and to see all of them contributing to something that was ultimately very, very important and rewarding to me, you know.
Yeah, and that became sort of would it be fair to say that a lot of your lyrics early on were very much a representation of the sort of subterranean America? Like that sort of thing you experienced in Chicago, you seem to reflect, or even maybe the dark side of of the town you grew up in, but it certainly seemed to represent the weirder side of American life.
There's a saying in statistics that streaks are not predictive. You can only recognize them in the rearview mirror, right? So I didn't know what I was writing about at the time, but having some time to look back on it, I realized that what I was trying to express in the music and in the content of the music in Big Black was the sensation of being outside and reveling in being outside of the inclusive culture. If the inclusive culture thought it was rejecting me, it was wrong. I was doing fine without it. That's what I can glean in retrospect. And at the time, what was on my mind was that the whole of human experience is available to everybody, which means that the sweet old lady at the bus stop at one point in her life might have been a can-can dancer, or, you know, and the guy in the barber chair, you know, he might have political predilections that would curl your hair, for example, or that the things that drove people to do things, their personal manias, none of us were immune to those things. And so I was trying to draw a bridge, sort of expressing the whole of humanity is nascent in all of us. Like, we could all be monsters. In the right circumstances, we could all be truly tragic figures, or truly evil, or potentially truly great. But it seemed like, on a cultural level, there was no shortage of uplifting, you know, finding the good in everyone themes in art. And so we concentrated on the flip side of that, which is to disavow this categorization of people as being either good or bad, and recognizing that all of us are capable of all of it, and that you know, it isn't the case that there are good people and bad people. There is good and bad, and we can all express that, you know. And I think that was what I was hung up on at the time. And I would choose, like, pungent or perverse things to highlight aspects of that.
Such as your early band name, Rape Man, which obviously is very, you know, a very shocking sort of name still today. For good reason.
I cannot defend the choice of that name. Yeah. I can defend the sort of process by which we got to that name, but it does seem preposterous, you know, at some distance it seems preposterous, and I don't regret it, because I'm not prone to regret, but I can understand the insult that the name of that name represents to people, and I don't think that people are wrong to be insulted. And
it was very much you guys representing a lot of lyrics as well from Big Black as well, and even some Shellac would fall into the ugly category in terms of themes. Is it what you were saying before about sort of making a point about these things existing? How much of it is kind of character and role playing in those songs? Obviously, it's not what your attitude is.
All of it. Yeah. I mean, there was another band that were contemporaries of Big Black in the 80s called Killdozer. And Michael Gerald said one of the smartest things that I've ever heard about this artistic distance between the person singing and the subject matter. He met a journalist, and the journalist said he was surprised that he was such a nice guy, because all of his songs had all of these horrible characters in them. And he said, "Oh, that's not us. That's the crazy people we sing about." And I think that pretty much encapsulates what I was thinking in writing in those bands, is that these are stories. They could be illustrative, or they could trigger some flash of recognition, but it's not us, you know.
You ever been offended yourself by anything in music? Is it possible? Like, not on a taste level, but in terms of that sort of content?
No. There are things that are harrowing, you know, but I have to admit that I respect when I can have that sensation, when I can be repulsed in a genuine fashion by any kind of art. Then I respect the power of that, and that as a, you know, I think that sort of underscores what a legitimate expressive tool it can be, if it can evoke a visceral sensation. And I don't think I would think less of someone who created something that genuinely upset me. I don't think I would think less of that person.
So, as a musician, where did it all start for you in terms of just playing guitar, I guess?
I would tool around on my father's guitar. My father played guitar, and he had guitars around the house. I would noodle around on them, doing just sort of aimlessly. And then when I decided I was going to start making music after hearing the Ramones, then I went to the store and bought a bass guitar and decided to learn how to play bass guitar. And then my friends and I formed a band, and that was about it.
Had one lesson, right?
I had one lesson. I was taught how to tune the bass, and then I was taught the difference between a major scale and a minor scale. And I thought, that is way too much information.
That's true. And how do you, listening to Shellac, I wasn't sure how you, and you all live in different parts of the world, the three of you.
Bob and I live in Chicago. Bob Weston, the bass player, and I live in Chicago. He runs a mastering studio. I run a recording studio, and so we interact with each other regularly in both professional and personal context. Todd, our drummer, lives in Minneapolis, which is an 8-hour car ride or a 4-hour flight away, and so he only gets to join us when we're doing formal stuff, like we schedule a rehearsal weekend or something, or if we have shows to play.
And how do you go about writing songs? Like, how does a Shellac song usually start?
The three of us will get together in the rehearsal room, and somebody will have an idea, either a conceptual idea or a little fragment of music, and we will try to play something along the lines of the conceptual idea. When I say that, it's not clear what I mean, but like, for example, we might have a notion for a song that would be, it starts with a big finish and then peters out for 4 minutes, you know? That might be a conceptual framework for a song. And so then we would go through the machinations of trying to execute that, trying to create something that fits that mental framework that we had coming in, without necessarily having any music attached to it. Like, we had a song, there's a song on the album Excellent Italian Greyhound called Be Prepared. And the beginning of the song is a series of false starts where we fail to come in together at the beginning of a song. And then the actual beginning of the song is in a different key, slightly different tempo, and we hit that perfectly, right? And then the context of that was that at the time, people were being given credit for things that were none of their doing. It was during the Bush administration, and people were being given credit for things that would have happened anyway, or things that they actually sort of interfered with, they were being given credit for. And the song is a kind of a litany of things that people have stumbled into and then either were honored for or felt proud of. And in this case, there's a sort of a pun there, which is that if you're trying to come in together and you give yourself enough attempts at it, eventually, accidentally, you're going to hit the downbeat at the same time. And you shouldn't really feel proud of that. That's so at the beginning of the song, there's a kind of a gag where we miss the entrance a few times, and then we come in together very professionally.
So you wouldn't have made it in James Brown's band?
No.
I actually hear a fair bit of kind of funk-laden grooves in Shellac, which sounds hilarious considering, you know, I don't think that you have ever...
I'm not a particularly funky person, no.
Just the associations. It's always punk rock, experimental music, but like, do you listen to a lot of kind of like endless groove type music or anything kind of in that realm?
No, I mean, any kind of music has its charm, you know, and I think there are certain like units that played together, like the James Brown's bands, the JBs and the Famous Flames or whatever. They're some incredibly tight, incredibly listenable music, you know. The same with bands like the Meters or the DC go-go bands like Trouble Funk. Like they play together as an ensemble in a way that's just infectious, and it's very, very moving to listen to that. So you can't fail to respond to that, but I also couldn't claim that it was a primary influence on me.
You run the band like a sort of, I mean, we're going to get to the engineering stuff soon, and you obviously do that probably most of the year. Most of the year you're in recording other people's music, but I have no doubt with the amount of tickets and records that Shellac could sell, that you guys could probably carve out a pretty good living off it if you chose to tour in all that time. But you keep it this sort of, regardless of whether you could pull it off, you do keep it this very pure, almost summer camp sort of band. You know, you seem to do it in this really fun style, and it's about your friendship. Why do you choose to do that as opposed to going down the traditional career road?
Well, in the 90s in particular, but starting in the 1980s, but in the 90s in particular, there was an inflation of the monetary value of recorded music, and bands and started to become, you know, career options for people where that had never been the case before. And we, having come out of the punk rock experience, didn't have particular respect for the commerce associated with music. We were much more interested in the experience of it, right? And we saw our friends and our peers getting pulled into this sort of careerist cycle where they were, you know, they would sign a record deal and then they would be obliged to make records and obliged to go on tour. Instead of seeing the opportunity to make a record as like this fantastic opportunity, it then became a burden and an obligation and a legal sense and a binding sense. And we just saw people get fried by it. Bands that were great bands to experience just wore themselves out, and the joy drained out of it. And we never wanted that to happen. I love my band so much. I don't ever want to resent it. And by not placing any expectations on it, by not making it our livelihood, that means we can do it as a pure joy. You know, every second that we get to play together is an escape from obligation, an escape from routine or any of the stress that comes along with having to do something. And so it's pure joy for us to play. And that also means that if it takes us 7 years to get a record together, no one can complain about it, you know. We don't have to worry about anybody sending the lawyers because it's been too long between albums. And so instead of releasing a bunch of albums according to a time schedule, some of which were probably awful owing to the conditions that we were under, we only ever have to release the records we really like, you know. And so I feel very good about everything we've done as a band because it happened at its natural pace rather than at a pace that's associated with some sort of commercial timeline, you know. So for me, it's never really been a conscious decision to do it in a way that was anti-careerist. It's just that it never occurred to me that I would want to make a career out of it, because when I saw other people make a career out of it, or out of anything, you know, like the job that I have, I own a recording studio and I'm a recording engineer. I love my job. You know, it's very gratifying, very rewarding work. But there are times when I don't want to do it, you know. There's times when I just want to sleep in and fuck that record. I don't want to make that record, you know. And I would never want to be in that situation with the band. I would never want to think, oh, Christ, we have to play another show. Like, I would consider that a failure if I was ever not ecstatic to be doing something with the band. And so by removing it from the careerist aspect, it means that we can do it forever, you know. Most of our peers, most of the bands that started around when we started in the early 90s, most of them have fizzled out. The ones that tried to make a go of it faster than those that were doing it sort of semi-seriously. But then I look at other bands that have just sort of adapted their lives to include the band as a facet of their lives, and they can keep going forever, you know. In particular, there's a band from the Netherlands called The X. They're a fantastic band. They've had a constantly evolving, constantly searching quality to their aesthetic. They've traveled the world. They've done tours of Ethiopia. You know, they've played with all manner of different musicians, of everyone from free jazz people to traditional ethnic musicians. They're constantly being playful and creative and developing their experience in music. And they've been going for 30-something years now, and it seems like they could go forever. And I consider that an option worth emulating. Whereas when I think of a band that's just grinding the circuit, you know, playing 20 shows a month at whatever spot will have them, you know, pumping out an album every year, whether anyone wants it or not, you know, I think of that as kind of hell, you know.
You're not wrong there. We've got to talk about the recording a bit. There's so many great recordings you've made. First off, who's probably the most exceptional person you feel, or some of the most exceptional musicians that you've sort of been wowed by? I know you treat it more like you've just got a job to do, you don't necessarily have to like the band, but are there a couple that come to mind?
Yes, although I think those are two separate things. I can be truly impressed by someone as a musician and their capabilities and their creativity and all that sort of thing without having high regard for the end result, right? But then again, I can also be truly impressed by somebody's resilience and their methodology and all that sort of stuff. And the end result is immaterial. The respect comes from something other than the end result. The respect comes from the process and the ability and the talent. And the most natural performing talent that I've ever encountered is a woman named Nina Nastasia from New York. She's a singer-songwriter. She has a beautiful angelic voice. She writes incredibly, just achingly sad, beautiful songs, and they seem to roll out of her effortlessly. And she plays with an ensemble of musicians that's different every time, and she manages to evoke a very sensitive backing from these people, regardless of who they are. She's probably played with 100 different musicians and probably got the performance of a lifetime out of each of them because of this sort of magical quality where the music seems to just flow out of her without any conscious thought. So she's a natural talent. I'm in awe of her. There are people who have certain aspects to their talent that are unique. I've said this before, but Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, who I worked with on an album with Robert Plant, is probably the most astute listener I've ever worked with in the studio. Like the way I described it was he can hear every bird in the flock. And he demonstrated that again and again when I was working with him. Like he was listening to a take of an orchestral passage, an impossibly dense orchestral piece that had 26 chairs playing. And he identified a sour note, and there was an error in a transcription for one of the musicians. And he identified this error in this, you know, dissonant, atonal, very complex, very dense piece of music. He identified it on the first listen, just following along the score, hearing all of the voices simultaneously. Incredibly impressive listener. Paired with that, he has an attitude about performance that I find very, very satisfying to work with. At one point, he had done a guitar solo as part of a live take of a song, and he decided he wanted to use that as the guitar solo in the final song. But there were a couple of things he wanted to correct in the solo, so we were going to punch in the little mistakes in the solo, the things that he didn't like. So he'd be listening along, and then he'd hear a little figure that he didn't think he executed well, that he didn't like, and say, I want to fix that. Carry on listening. And then I heard what was an obvious clam to me, like, you know, the music is flowing along nicely, the solo is developing, and then there's a clunker, like there's a dead note or something. And he didn't remark on that at all, carried on to the next bit, kept listening, heard another little figure that was very slightly out of whack to his mind, say, I want to fix that. And then I made my notes about which things he wanted to repair, and then I rewound to the spot where I heard the clunker, and I heard this dead note here, do you want to fix that? And he heard that go by, and there was an obvious dead note, not a sour note, but just like a note that was thumbed or not cleanly played. And he was like, that's fine, they'll get the idea. And I thought that was incredibly revealing, that he had an idea of how this motif was supposed to be played, and he didn't think that idea came across, so he wanted to fix that. But the bit that was obvious, where it was just a note missing, whatever, that's fine, you know. So he wasn't precious about it wasn't a perfectionist attitude. He was very specifically interested in the idea coming across, like what his what his idea was. And if you thought you got the idea with this sort of implied note, then that's fine. But if you weren't going to get the idea because it was crudely rendered, then he had to go in and fix it, and nothing would stop him, you know. And I thought that was really enlightening to hear him express it that way. Another person with a very, very similar skill and very similar approach is Kim Deal from the Breeders and the Pixies. Her music has gotten successively more idiosyncratic and more personal and more specific to her tastes as she's matured as an artist, to the point now where she has a fully conceived and realized version of her music before she ever hears a single thing. And she is, again, an extremely astute listener. And she can hear the tiniest thing that doesn't suit her. And some of the things that she likes or that she wants are the charming eccentricities or the things that might be considered excessive, or, you know, like when you hit one note on the bass guitar and it's way louder than all the other ones. Like, that might just rub her tummy in a way that she really, really wants, you know. So whereas that might be, on a technical level, might be considered an error, that might be the whole rationale for her. And so she's another person who's a joy to work with. It's excruciating making records with her because it takes forever to get her to a point where she's satisfied. But when she's satisfied, you know she's gotten precisely what she's looking for. Probably the most gifted musician I've ever worked with is a woman named Joanna Newsom. She's a harp player, and she plays piano and she sings. I've worked on a couple of records with her, and her facility on the harp, which is a perverse, like, medieval torture instrument, right? Her fluidity and her expressiveness on that instrument are incredible. She plays immaculately cleanly and plays in a style that's unique to her. I've never heard another harpist that sounds like her or that plays the kind of music that she plays. And she can do she can do it sort of automatically while she's singing or, you know, answering a phone call or whatever. It's a joy to work with her, and I think she is a unique talent.
It's funny with all these names you just mentioned. You could add, you know, Page and Plant, The Stooges, Cheap Trick, Will Oldham, all sorts of amazing musical names that are calling you for your services, but you don't see what you do as a creative thing as an engineer, right? You see, the producer role is not something you feel comfortable in, right?
I'm not comfortable in the distinction that I make between producer and engineer is the producer is the person who's responsible for all of the artistic decisions on the record, in the manner of a film director, right? Is responsible for all the artistic decisions on a film, and I don't take that responsibility for the records that I work on. I assume that the musicians, that the band that I'm working with, have that worked out already. Like, they have their aesthetic worked out already. So all of those creative decisions are their responsibility. And my job is to execute those ideas from a technical perspective. I mean, there are a number of things that come into play there, but I feel like my tastes as a listener are at times quite perverse, and the things that amuse me as a listener might be considered ugly or unflattering to the general listening audience or a specific audience for a certain artist, right? So I would be uncomfortable having that band make an ugly record that didn't suit them just to amuse me, you know, because they have to carry that record with them to their graves. Like, for the rest of their lives, that's going to be the record that they made, and they have to answer for it. And I'm uncomfortable imposing my aesthetic on it. And also, I'm prone to what I refer to as listener error, where I'll hear something and I won't get it. I won't understand why it's important or why the band is doing that. And so I have to trust their instincts about why they're doing it. I've told this story before, but I have had the experience of seeing a band work on a particular song that was very important to them, the whole time in the back of my mind, I'm thinking this song is a turkey. You know, this is, you know, the weakest of the material that we're working on, guys. Why are you burning yourselves out on it, right? I've had the experience of, in the back of my mind, that thought crops up now and again. I suppress it so that I can get on with the job, but it keeps coming back. Like, you guys are spinning your wheels. This is a piece of shit, right? You know. And then, of course, months or years down the pike, when the record is out and it's in context with the rest of their career and the rest of the music spectrum, and I'm not hearing it as a technical problem in the studio, it becomes obvious what was charming about it. And in one case, there was a song that I would not have included on an album if it was up to me that ended up being a #1 hit and the band's, you know, favorite song on the record. Yeah. So like that sort of thing happens again and again. And I've proven to myself that I don't have an ear for what other people will like, and I should not make any presumptions on that in that regard. I should let the band sort out their music, and then between them and their audience, they can figure out which are the good ones. You know? Yeah.
I think it was the famously ill-fated Fugazi album, very good friends of yours, and you guys, was it Red Medicine they were working on demos for? I did a session for them prior to them recording the album In on the Kill Taker. Yeah. And we were originally just going to record a song or two, and we got on a roll, and we decided to carry on recording, and they had finished, the previous weekend, they'd finished writing all the material for the album, so we recorded the entire album. And we were having a great time, just having a high old time, really enjoying each other's company, a lot of laughs. You know, everyone was feeling very good about how things were going. And you know, they were a favorite band of mine, so I was very involved and, you know, I was very emotionally attached to the music. And then on their trip home, they listened to the record and hated it, you know. Was it you saying you thought maybe your enthusiasm got in the way that time because you were so excited by
Absolutely.
the music?
I'm certain that my emotional involvement in it clouded my judgment in some technical sense. Do you smell fire right now? So do I. Should we be concerned?
I'm more concerned when I have 8 minutes left and I've only asked you like 200 or 300 questions. Yeah. Was Shellac the first band to put a CD? We have to move on. We can't let this get in the way. Was Shellac the first band to put a free CD in an LP sleeve, which is now commonplace to have a digital download and or a CD in there?
I don't know if we were first, but I know that we were correct. We started at a certain juncture. We realized that people buying an LP might also want to be able to play the record at work or in a car or something like that. And cassette tapes were no longer as popular as they had been. That the solution in the 90s would have been they would just make a cassette tape of it and then play the cassette at work or whatever. So we started including a free CD with the LP copies of our records, and we've done that since then. So as soon as we decided we were going to start doing that, we just kept it up. And it is still possible to buy the CD-only version of the record, but if you buy the LP version, you get the CD version. So in a way, it's a subtle encouragement for people to buy the vinyl record, but it doesn't work out that way because people who don't have a record player have no need for, you know, a decorative record, you know. So they would buy the CD version anyway.
As an engineer, musician, you're obviously heavily into sound and the detail of sound. Do you have any thoughts on format? It's now, you know, you must record a record and not really know how it's going to be heard now, which is very different to what it would have been in the 80s. Would you have any? Yeah, well, I mean,
you never really knew how it was going to be heard. In the 80s, there were cassette tapes, there were Walkman, you know, there were crappy hi-fis and good hi-fis, and things would get played on the radio. Like you never really know. You could never know how people were going to listen to music. So I've always put those considerations out of my mind. It's never crossed my mind what the end listener is going to be listening on, because whatever it is now, assuming the record has some shelf life, that might be different in 20 years. And so my concern has always been with making the master in the control room sound as good as I could make it, so that it was satisfying to listen to on a reference system. And then presumably what was good about it would survive through whatever cheapening happened after the fact. And the analogy that I use is that if you call your mother on the telephone, the sound coming out of that little speaker on the telephone, that doesn't sound like your mother's voice. But you can recognize your mother through it, and what you love about your mother you can recognize through that sound. And it's the same with when you hear a favorite song on the radio, even if it's coming out of a crappy little radio, you recognize it as a favorite song. Something about it that you like survives that sound quality, and the sound quality is not the defining characteristic of it. Now, as a professional, it's my obligation to try to make the sound as good and as flattering as I can. But I recognize that the sound is just in service of those ideas that Jimmy Page was talking about. And as long as people get the idea, then everything is working fine. And I'm not particularly precious about what format of music people listen to. I prefer listening to vinyl records just because, as someone who spends all day, every day listening to original master tapes, I have a very good sense memory of what those master tapes sound like. And if I hear one of those records or one of those recordings on a well-made vinyl record, to my ear, that's the closest experience to listening to the master tape in the control room. When you're listening at home, that's as close as you can get, is a well-made vinyl record. Now, you can make crappy records, which don't sound good, and you can make CDs, which are okay. They don't sound great, but they sound okay. And then you can make, a bunch of good and bad, non-physical digital formats that sound either good or terrible. But those are all made from an original master tape, and the technologies around those subordinate media are going to change over time. And it may be possible in the future to have a much better resolution home playback system than is possible now. So I think it's important that the master tape, which is going to survive long term, be as good as it possibly can, so that if in the future there's an opportunity to present a better sound quality version of it, then that can be taken advantage of. I'll give you one example. A couple of years ago, I was involved in the 20th anniversary remaster and special edition of the Nirvana In Utero album that I worked on. It was their last studio album. And there was a deluxe double 12-inch 45 RPM vinyl version of that, which is as good on a technical level, as good as I think records can be made. The mastering was done direct into metal rather than being cut into lacquer and then electroplated to metal. It was cut directly into metal at Abbey Road Mastering Studios from the original master tapes in an all-analog transfer with as good a quality, minimal processing, heavy pressings, virgin vinyl, yada yada. Like everything about it was done as well as I know how to make a record. Everyone involved agreed that they were going to go to the end stop of quality for making a record. And that record is a shocking contrast to the sort of perfunctory release that record got originally, when it was just one of 20 titles that were being released that month or whatever. And that wouldn't have been possible if the original master tape had not survived intact to this point with better resolution than the intended final format at the time. So we were now able, in 2013, we were able to make a better, more hi-fi, more accurate transfer of that record than was possible back in the heyday of that record.
I think we need to get one tech question in there. Otherwise there'd be a whole bunch of disappointed people. The clock keeps switching from there we go, 0 it is now. It was 6, 4, 3.
Wow.
They keep changing it. This is the clock that tells us how
Maybe
long
that's
we've got
what's
left.
on fire.
Is it time for questions, Aaron? It is, yes.
Have we resolved what the fire smell is?
You're not allowed to ask questions.
All right.
Does anyone want to kick off with a question for Steve?
Hi, Steve. My name's Taylor. I was wondering what it was like working with Nirvana.
Nirvana, when I worked with them, were a very well-rehearsed working band. They were at the peak of their powers, both creatively and in performing sense. They'd been touring consistently for several years. They were very well-rehearsed, and they had their shit together, and it was a pleasure. The recording session was an absolute pleasure. We were essentially done with the record in 12 days, and it was very much in keeping with all of the other sessions that I'd been doing at the time. I thought of them as peers. We had had a lot of common experiences. We knew a lot of the same people. We had a lot of the same aesthetic touchstones. I wasn't a particular fan of Nirvana's music before I started working with them, but over the course of working on that album, I developed a respect for them that I wouldn't have been able to glean in any other context. And I think Kurt was a unique and gifted songwriter and singer, and I think that band as a coherent unit is one of the more powerful bands of their era. And individually, they were, very, very good at what they were doing. Kurt was a very creative and interesting thinker musically. Chris Novoselic was the perfect backbone as a bass player, and he's a childhood friend of Kurt, so they had a bond, a human bond that was evident from the first moment. And Dave Grohl is, if not the best, one of the best rock drummers ever. Very sensitive, very creative drummer. It was a joy to work on that record. It wasn't weird, or if that's what you're asking.
Apparently we're not allowed to pick the question, people, are we?
What's that?
Questions. The floor picks the questions, I believe.
Right.
Yes.
Hi, Steve. You mentioned that you didn't want to really get into the creative side when you're engineering an album, and I really understand where you're coming from there. You explained it really well. What happens when a band comes to you and wants that creative input that a producer or an arranger would bring to the party? I'm sure that must have happened to you with your CV and.
Well, I have a conversation at the beginning of the session. I'll have a conversation with the band, and we'll talk about what kind of records they like, what kind of music they listen to, what kind of things inspired them, or what kind of things they're emulating. If they've specifically asked me to work on their record, like what records that I've done did they think had an aesthetic or had a sound quality that would suit them? Are there any particular moments that they wanted to emulate? Like, you have these conversations where you can get their ambitions out on the table, and there is a notion in the professional engineering or production community that we add something extra, an outside perspective, that we are somehow like an impartial voice on the creative decisions. And I'm of the opinion that impartiality has no place in a creative process. I feel like making a record should be a completely selfish enterprise, that the band should be actively rejecting anyone else's opinion. And if the band is made comfortable enough to make their own decisions, I've never gotten to a point in a session where a band simply couldn't decide what they wanted to do. In a lot of cases, it requires them hearing themselves in a couple of different contexts before they can choose the one that they think is the correct path or whatever. But ultimately, this notion of outside creative input, I think, is somewhat counterfeited by the results that I've seen when bands are allowed to make all of their own decisions. I feel like if you listen to pop music, that's generally made by a team of professionals, each putting in their input, and the effect of it, regardless of the style, the effect of that sort of committee music making tends to be quite static, like from song to song or artist to artist or genre to genre. the impression that it makes on you is not one of a singular vision imposing itself by strength of will on and an artistic or creative impulse, right? You get the impression that there were a lot of solutions superimposed on a problem, right? And at least I do. That's the impression I get. But then when I listen to the music that's most moving to me, I feel like I'm genuinely communing or communicating, not communing, we're not in the same room, but I'm genuinely communicating in some way with the person that made that record. Like and that doesn't happen by committee, you know. And I feel like that is a much more valuable experience, both for the musician and as a listener. That direct conduit. The whole reason that someone is expressing themselves is because they want to communicate with other people. They want to have the ideas and their creative impulse. They want that to be shared, and they want other people to respond to that, or to have the option of responding, right? And the less I fiddle with it on the way by, I feel the more likely it is that they're going to have that unique connection. And I think that's the reason that people are compelled to make music, is to have that possibility to potentially speak to people through time again and again and again without actually having to meet them, you know. We were instructed not to call on people by pointing, so we...
You've captured some pretty formidable drum sounds. I'm a huge fan of the Jesus Lizard. Mac McNeely's drumming is incredible. How important is the room for capturing sort of heavy, kind of Bonham-esque style, you know, aggressive drumming?
Well, I do tend to use the room sound around the drum kit in recordings when it's flattering. There are some instances, if you're forced into working in a studio where the room sound is not flattering, where you can't have a preconceived notion of what it should sound like. You have to contend with the sound as it is. So to answer your question of how important the room sound is, it depends on the room that you happen to be recording in. If you're recording in a very flattering room and you open the room mics and it adds a lot of character, then you can indulge yourself and you get this very voluptuous, very broad, lively sound. If you're working in a studio that's smaller, deader, drier, there may still be some utility to the room sound, but you can't fool Mother Nature. You can't make a small room sound large. So the key from a frustration standpoint as an engineer, I'm assuming you're speaking as an engineer in technical capacity, the key to avoiding frustration is not to fight the organic sound that you're getting, but find a way to make the organic sound that you're hearing suit the music. Because it's not the case that you can create any sound you want from any starting point. You have to adapt your expectations to what things actually sound like.
What's your cat's name?
I have 3 cats at the moment. Pip is the old lady. She's, I want to say she's 15 years old now. She's adorable and tiny and deaf and has this little pip of a voice. When she says something, she just... and that's how she got named Pip, right? Then the 2 brothers, Bacon and Dynamite... Bacon and Dynamite are very energetic. They're quite a bit younger. They're only 4 or 5 years old, and they tear ass all over the house, and they're constantly wrestling and knocking things down. I've had many cats. I've been very lucky with my cat society. The cats I've met have all been sterling #1 cats. But at the moment, it's Pip, Bacon, and Dynamite.
Hey, Steve. My name's Sam.
there's undoubtedly been a huge resurgence in the popularity of vinyl as a format recently.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say I've been pretty disappointed with some of the records that I've bought that are new pressings. They've sounded really two-dimensional. There's been a lot of sort of sibilant clipping on vocals and things. So I was just wondering what your thoughts on why that might be happening.
Well, my bandmate Bob Weston, who is a mastering engineer and a vinyl cutting engineer, would be a better person to answer on a technical level. I can tell you that during the heyday of vinyl recording, studios were run in a fairly comprehensive fashion with a degree of professionalism that is somewhat absent now, since everything is kind of ad hoc. So it's quite likely that records are being pressed from masters that were not made under professional conditions. If what you're saying is that you've heard a CD version of a record and it sounded good, and a vinyl version of the record and it sounded bad, then that is definitely a mastering or manufacturing fault, because there's no reason that there should be a degradation in sound quality for vinyl cutting. There's a kind of a curiosity about the resurgence in vinyl, which is that it's now possible for any band, even a small band, small independent band, to get a better, more accurate vinyl pressing than was possible for even superstars during the heyday of vinyl records. During the heyday of vinyl records, the 70s and 80s, for example, original master tapes were not often used to cut the lacquers from which records would be pressed. They often used production masters, which were equalized copies of the original session master. And in some cases, for, say, territorial release, like for the Australian release or for the Asian release or for the African release or whatever, those would be copies of copies of copies. So records were being cut from tapes that were copies of copies of copies of the master tape rather than from the original master tape. They were also being done in a kind of a perfunctory fashion, where you have to knock out so many titles a day, and then they get shipped off for pressing without very much quality control, without approvals being made of the lacquers and things like that. That doesn't happen anymore. Now, even the smallest, most skinflint independent band can have a record cut from their original master, whether it's a digital master or an analog master. They can use the original source material. The pressing plants are doing much smaller production runs, so they can be much more careful about the pressings. It used to be that you would get flimsy records that were prone to warping or were wobbly or pressed off center or something like that, because the pressing plants were cranking out millions of LPs. And now it's much more of a boutique product. The records themselves are much more expensive. They're typically much heavier, much flatter, much better quality than they were during the heyday of the vinyl era. So I think it's slightly ironic that Jimmy and the Turd Heads or whatever can get a more faithful, better quality record pressed than, say, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones could. And just speaking purely in technical terms, the vinyl records that are being made now can be made to a much higher standard as a matter of routine than could vinyl records during the heyday of the vinyl era. And I find that irony delicious.
We've got time for one more.
Hi there. Hi there. You wrote an article for Maximum Rock and Roll in the early 90s about bands being signed, punk rock and hardcore bands being signed, and the trials and tribulations after they did. You talked about it a little bit already. Do you want to elaborate on the shit that they had to go through and still do?
What he's referring to is an article that I wrote for a magazine called The Baffler that was reprinted in Maximum Rock and Roll and then reprinted elsewhere. As an aside, The Baffler, the magazine that I wrote that article for, had in their masthead a declaration that the contents of their magazine was in the public domain and that everyone should feel free to reproduce it in whatever form they wanted. So that was an early experiment in open copyright control-free publishing. And one of the offshoots of that was that that article has been reprinted in quite a lot more places than it might have been otherwise. The first one of them being that Maximum Rock and Roll reprint. But in any case, that was an article explaining the ways that a band would be manipulated and exploited in signing a record deal with a big record company. We don't really have to concern ourselves with that much anymore because big record companies aren't going to be around for very much longer, and their influence is fading, with the exception of that sort of automated pop music that we were discussing earlier, where they are still sort of the venue for that kind of music. Other than people in that sphere, and those people have quite a lot of professional handlers and insulation, so those people are sort of being looked after professionally. The people in my peer group are, generally speaking, no longer interacting with those big record labels. Those big record labels are much less important for penetration into an audience, distribution, access to things like airplay is now sort of automatic. The internet has done an awful lot of the work in promoting music and allowing people to hear music. So you no longer have to do things like pay for payola to get your record played on the radio, or buy advertising space in a record store in order to get the record store to promote your record, and things like that are no longer necessary. So the exploitive nature of the music industry, while still there in spirit, has much less of an influence on the day-to-day actions or behavior of bands. Many more bands are now conducting their entire careers outside of the system of the big record labels and the sort of vertical monopolies that they represented. So while that article was, I think, was on point in its day in the early 90s, sort of explaining the pitfalls of being associated with a record label, I think that there's much less of a warning needed now, because the temptation to get involved with a big record label is much less. The perceived advantage of being involved with a record label is quite a bit less now. The financial backing and the clout within the industry, for example, are quite a bit more subdued, and you can accomplish almost everything that on your own that previously would have required professionals. So I don't feel like the warnings in that article are particularly germane today, although I still feel like it was an accurate representation of the way that bands were being exploited at the time in the early 90s.
So many things I wanted to ask you, but we all appreciate you being so generous with your time and your answers. So thanks, Steve Albini.